This week on The Right Side, a First Nations band in BC refused to evacuate. The Alberta Finance Minister isn't concerned with an interest rate hike. A survey finds 71% of Canadians disagree with the Khadr settlement. And the media ignores NDP candidates' extreme views on capitalism. This is The Right Side, episode 25, recorded Saturday, July 15th, 2017. The media ignores. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for another episode of The Right Side. Patrick and I are back this week, as we are every week.
Yeah, it's good to be back on episode 25. It's amazing how we've gotten up this far, but it's been a fun ride, that's for sure.
Indeed it has. So if you're joining us for the first time, our objective here is to cut through bias and sensationalism in the media. And, you know, some would have us believe that, right side means it's a podcast aimed at the providing the right side, the conservative side of the news spectrum. But believe it or not, when they start throwing bias at the media when they get elected in Canada, BC, or Alberta, or anywhere, we will, of course, cut through that as well. But right now, this week here, we do have lots of interesting stories to talk about of the media not being very truthful, and I think we're going to start right in BC with a story to deal with the forest fires in the First Nations in northern BC. So what do you got?
Yeah, so last week we talked about BC being put under a state of emergency, and as far as I know, that's still the case this week, and actually much of the Caribou-Chilcotin region still remains on fire, and despite the frequent winds and the lightning strikes that are really complicating matters, it appears that the brave firefighters are making some progress. And a lot of emergency crews are trying to keep as many people safe as possible, but some are actually refusing to leave their homes, which includes part of a First Nations band about 2 hours west of Williams Lake, which you may remember is the area around which contains the most of the worst and the most dangerous wildfires that we're having right now. So Chief Joe Alphonse of the Clayton-Cotin First Nations community of Anaheim Reserve announced that several hundred members of the community would be staying behind, mostly to fight the fires and to set up fire blockades to save the town. So Alphonse has said that emotions had run high between him and the RCMP when he told officers that the residents wouldn't be obeying an evacuation order as several wildfires were threatening the community. He said, quote, "We're going to fight for our place. We'd rather be out there fighting, protecting, than allow someone else to do it for us. We appreciate the work of firefighters, but this is what we want." So the chief also said that he had a run-in with the RCMP on Sunday over his decision to stay put. He said, quote, "I notified them that we're not leaving. Community stress levels were really high, and RCMP said for those who don't leave, they will call the Ministry of Children and remove the children. After that," Alphonse said, "tempers had flared. At that point, I kind of lost it a little bit and said, we're not leaving. If you guys want to set up roadblocks on either end of our reserve, that's fine, but we'll set up roadblocks right next to yours to stop you guys from getting in. They told me our roadblock wouldn't hold them back, but I said, it may not hold you back, but once you start dodging bullets, you'll start turning around." And he was asked to clarify the latter part of his comments, and he said, "Take it however you want. I made a statement, and that's that." So, when an evacuation order goes into effect, the RCMP mandate is to advise people to move to safety and inform them of the risks that they take in staying behind. Adults who are mentally competent are entitled to remain on their property if they wish. However, Mounties could remove minors under the Child, Family, and Community Service Act if they were in danger. Children may be removed for their own safety, which RCMP spokesman Sergeant Annie Linto said. "It's certainly not where we want to get, and there's a fair amount of discretion, but we do have a responsibility to protect those who are not in a position to make adult decisions. Our RCMP First Nations policing officers continue to engage with the community, and there is an understanding around our concerns for their safety," she said. As the days went on, it appears that emotions have settled, though, and the community's Aboriginal firefighters are working with BC wildfire service crews. Word came in Thursday that 300 firefighters from Alberta were moving into the area. Alphonse remained adamant on Thursday that they were staying, saying that he believes that they have received more resources from the government because of that very decision. He also said staying and fighting the fires is good for the community, which has been improving slowly in the past decade, and recently rebuilt a church and a health center destroyed by arson, as well as constructing a new elementary school. He said it gives everybody a role, stepping up and fighting for the community. It will give people confidence to fight for other issues, maybe social issues, said Alphonse. By staying in the community, it's nothing but positive for us. Something that's really interesting about this is that even though it seems though relations between the First Nations band and the RCMP have gotten more amiable since this first standoff, it's very possible that the situation could have turned into another Oka crisis. And for those who don't know, the Oka crisis occurred in 1990 when the town of Oka, Quebec, approved the development of an expanded golf course on land that was considered a sacred burial ground by the Mohawk tribe that were living in the area, without consultation of that Mohawk tribe. And members of the tribe then blockaded the area, refused to let anyone in, and the standoff actually resulted in 2 casualties and around 100 wounded on both sides, though with the gunfire going back and forth it could have been much worse. The Oka crisis, of course, received a lot of attention, and other First Nations bands blockaded or protested other government properties all around the country in solidarity with the Oka Mohawks. So what does this have to do with the Anaheim Reserve refusing to leave and threatening to set up a blockade if the RCMP tried to take the children away? Well, if the RCMP had actually followed the law in this case and taken the band's minors, they probably would have had a huge problem on their hands, and relations with First Nations bands would have been set back decades. So when it comes to emergencies such as wildfires, it's sometimes not always clear what the best way is to solve a problem.
I think this also brings into attention a lot of the misconceptions about how law ends up working out there, because the RCMP feels it's their jurisdiction, but as you said here in the story, the folks on the band also felt as though this was their jurisdiction, and they felt a reason to protect it on their own because they don't necessarily feel that affinity with the RCMP and the Canadian institution, so to speak. I think that would be a fair way of putting it. And ultimately, this isn't something that we heard about that much in Alberta, when in reality we could have a situation much like this here in Alberta if a wildfire started forcing evacuations in our neck of the woods. So, it's quite amazing that we didn't see this on the national news. It seems to be relatively limited to BC.
Yeah, it was just shown in BC sections of news websites very briefly for maybe a day or two, and then it kind of just got buried under all the rest. There has been a lot of coverage on the wildfires in BC particularly, but this particular thing I didn't think got covered very much at all. I saw it in the local Vancouver province as well as on the CBC, but other than that I really didn't see it anywhere. And I think for how big of an issue this could have become, I think it deserved to get more attention. The fact that they were threatening to set up a blockade and get them to retreat with gunfire. They were actually threatening to do that. I think it's quite serious, and it's something that could have gotten a lot worse if they hadn't been able to work things out.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think if the government structure was different in BC and these orders actually did come down from a government at the time, we probably would have heard more about it. And it raises a whole nother issue that's going to need to be dealt with one day about relations between these bands and the government as to who has jurisdiction, and if they indeed want to look after their own affairs, maybe that's something the federal government can look into going forward. I know in the federal conservative leadership race, Maxime Bernier was kind of going towards that regard with modifying the Indian Act.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's something that I don't think it received that much attention in BC also because we're kind of in a transition period for the government. The NDP haven't been sworn in yet. The Liberals haven't, quite left. So I think a lot of the a lot of this politically could have had a lot more damage to one government or another had
Yeah,
they actually been
yeah,
in. But it
right.
just came down basically from the public service and the RCMP. So it could have been probably handled with a lot more decisively, but I think the RCMP negotiators probably realized how big of a situation it could have
Yep.
become, and I think they negotiated very well by that fact. And from at the last look, it looks like the town is still under threat, but the fires haven't really gotten much closer to it due to the effects of the the firefighters.
Yeah, and also, I mean, the RCMP has experience with this in the past in other natural disasters like the High River floods back in 2012 in Alberta, and when they forcibly entered houses to remove guns. So the RCMP is no stranger to controversy in this, so they were probably looking and hoping that they could avoid that in this scenario, which looks like they did.
Mm-hmm.
All right, you ready for Alberta?
I'm always ready for Alberta.
All right, yes, you won't forget about Alberta now, will you?
I would never forget about Alberta.
So this week, as you guys might have heard, the Bank of Canada raised the key lending rate by 0.25% to 0.75%. This ultimately affects everyone who has a loan or is looking to borrow money. And what's often overlooked by this is that it also affects governments who are in debt. So here in Alberta, Finance Minister Joe Ceci isn't happy about the increase in the interest rates. He said, "I would have appreciated a little more time. I think Albertans would have appreciated a little more time as well. We've had a pretty stable house prices here and low mortgages, and this will cause a little bit of a tick in that." What's clear based on the Finance Minister's comments here is that he feels that Alberta is not ready for an interest rate hike. However, the rest of Canada has an economy that is doing well and could benefit from the cooling off factor that an interest rate hike provides. When an interest rate is hiked, basically what happens is this slows the pace of lending by the banks and the amounts of lending requested by their customers, businesses, and normal individuals. This is done in the situation where the economy is performing better than expected. The recent interest rate hike here in Canada was perceived well by the stock markets, and the Canadian dollar went up to a new high of 79 cents compared to the US dollar over the last year. This ultimately makes Canada more competitive on the global stage and is a very encouraging sign to businesses who export to the US and other countries. The reason that our finance minister, Joe Ceci, doesn't find the interest rate acceptable to Alberta is that the economy here is still struggling. Plus, also, Alberta has an increasingly large debt that needs to be paid off. According to the NDP government, a rise in interest rates by 1% would mean an extra $230 million in debt servicing costs. Therefore, a 0.25% interest rate increase, as we just had happen, means the province needs to pay an extra $57.5 million in servicing costs on our debt. So while we often hear about what increasing interest rates might mean for the civilian population, it's often not talked about that these interest rate hikes also have a huge impact on government. Alberta has an increasing debt and will be similarly impacted by any future rate increases. This summer, that extra $57.5 million in debt servicing fees could have been spent on other services had we not been in deficit and accumulating debt. Same's also true for the federal government, which shows no sign of returning to a surplus until the early 2050s. And as we talked about before, we will have roughly a $1 trillion national debt by this time. So what the media ultimately needs to focus on, in addition to warning homeowners and people who hold loans about interest rate increases, is that governments also are impacted by these interest rate hikes. And that affects everyone because the amount of money that we spend on servicing the debt could be better spent on services both at the provincial and federal level. So this is something that really wasn't mentioned all that much in the media this week. It was these few stories here. It was mentioned in regards to Alberta, but not really Canada. So this is just something to think about when we're talking about how the interest rate increases affect everyone in Canada.
Yeah, and I think when the news cycle came out and it was known that they were going to increase the interest rate, a lot of it was made in regards to the every person and how and how you can deal with it as a homeowner or as a loaner or anything like that. But yeah, they don't really mention very much about governments and government debt whatsoever on the media, and that's something that they really should do. And I think this cycle, when they brought it out, it was really dominating news when it first came out, to the detriment of a lot of other stories that could have been covered. I remember my dad was watching the news the day before we came up here. He said, "Well, I was wanting to learn about what was happening with the economy and what was happening in BC with all the wildfires, but they couldn't stop talking about the interest rate." So it's something that.
So they're talking about it, but they're not even talking about what it means for the entire country.
Yeah, they're not talking about the right things. They're basically saying a lot about certain issues, but they're not going too in-depth about it. And I think that's something that the media really has to do a lot more of, is not only covering more stories more thoroughly, but the ones that they do have, they're only covering it by certain angles. And I think by doing so, they're doing a disservice.
Right, because just think of how many extra doctors or teachers could be hired in Alberta if we weren't paying this $57.5 million increase on debt servicing fees, right?
Yeah. And if they had all that extra money, I mean, who knows what they could pay for.
Yeah, and, another thing that is not really mentioned at all in this story is that the finance minister didn't really feel this was an issue and kind of just shrugged it off. Meanwhile, the rest of Canada here is enjoying this because it means that, hey, our economy is doing well. We're able to, compete stronger with the U.S. now. And I would have appreciated a little bit more coverage in the local Alberta media about what exactly the finance minister's response to this was.
Mm-hmm.
So, and as we said here, an increase by 1% would be $230 million, and they are expected to increase it again this fall. So it's definitely going to be lots of money that we're spending on servicing debt here, and that the federal government will be spending more as well. So hopefully when that next interest rate bump happens, we'll see more discussion in that regard.
Mm-hmm. And hopefully the economy in Alberta will be doing better by then as well.
All right. So let's have a bit of a follow-up from last week then, shall we? What do we got for Canada?
Yeah, so at the right side, we always have to remember to take polls with a grain of salt, as they have been wrong before on many different occasions. However, I think it's really important to note that when they do produce statistics that are overwhelmingly on one side of an issue, we have to follow up on it. And with that, we have a follow-up on last week's story on Omar Khadr. So remember last week, Shane talked about a lot of different things regarding Omar Khadr, a little bit on his backstory, and then what the government did. So a new survey came out just this week from the Angus Reid Institute that indicated that 71% of Canadians are of the opinion that the federal government made the wrong decision in settling a lawsuit with former child soldier Omar Khadr, and instead apologizing and paying him $10.5 million in compensation for his treatment as a prisoner in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. So according to the survey, most respondents thought the Trudeau government should have fought the case and left it to the courts to decide whether Khadr was wrongfully imprisoned. So you're gonna make note there that that quote is basically from the Angus Reid Institute page, and they made mention that Omar Khadr was the former child soldier, and that he had the compensation was for his treatment as a prisoner in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, not for violating his Canadian charter rights. So as it seems there, you already have to kind of take the poll with a grain of salt, just on the way that they're writing their article.
Child soldier, because he was in Afghanistan willingly with his parents. He wasn't being forced necessarily to fight.
Mm-hmm. So further, it's noted that 65% of Canadians reject the notion that government officials had, quote, no choice but to settle. But money appears to be the main source of opposition to the deal. Canadians are slightly more inclined to have said sorry to Khadr than to offer compensation, had the decision been in their own hands. Around 64% also believe that Khadr remains a, quote, potential radicalized threat now living in Canada. So I kind of looked into that a little bit and thought it was kind of interesting how they said that money was the main source of opposition. I think a lot of it could come down to that they thought that an apology would suffice and not an apology plus compensation. So I think, interestingly, in no province was there a majority of people that believed that the Trudeau government had made the right decision to settle. So residents in BC and Quebec were actually the two provinces most likely to be in favor of the government's decision at just 32%, whereas the province with the lowest number of support for the settlement is, unsurprisingly, Alberta at just 15%. So as we mentioned last week, Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale he blamed the previous Conservative government of Stephen Harper for not dealing with the issue sooner, while current Conservative leader Andrew Scheer responded by calling the settlement disgusting. So that's interesting to note because the Angus Reid article says that, quote, unsurprisingly, views diverge sharply along political lines, whereas past Conservative voters are unequivocal in their views. There is less consensus among those who voted Liberal and NDP in the 2015 election. So I actually looked at some of the numbers there, and it is true that just 9% of Conservative supporters surveyed agreed with the settlement. But interestingly, Liberal and NDP supporters also didn't agree with the decision at just 39% and 36% respectively, when the above quote that I kind of just read makes it seem like the numbers are a lot closer.
What was
right?
what was really baffling to me on this is that the NDP support this less than the Liberals do.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's kind of not surprising in a sense because you'd think that the Liberal supporters would support their own government that they voted for, more so than the NDP, who generally do side on issues a lot with the Liberals, but do sometimes think that they don't go far enough. So the survey, it just mentions the Conservative, the Liberal, and NDP supporters. It doesn't make note of any Bloc Québécois or Green supporters, although we do know that Green Party leader Elizabeth May did drunkenly mention during an Ottawa Press Gallery dinner in 2015 that, quote, Omar Khadr has more class than the whole bleeping Conservative cabinet. So I think it's clear that at least one Green Party member agrees with the decision. But it's interesting that the federal government decision to settle with Omar Khadr and to give him $10.5 million, it comes shortly after Parliament went on recess for the summer, meaning that the opposition parties wouldn't be able to grill the government on the decision. But it also appears that the attempt to keep this under wraps has failed, as it has definitely lasted through several news cycles. So with the clear majority of people against the Khadr settlement, it's clear that the government needs to be held account for its decision on the fact. But of course, the best way to do that will be in the next election in 2019. We're kind of somehow halfway there already.
You know, I have two things to say about this in regards to the reporting that's been going on about this. I believe it was broken by Globe and Mail's Robert Fife, who initially broke that this payment would be going out, and that's what caused the Liberal government to rush it forward. It wasn't supposed to happen for some time, but people got wind of it, and they wanted to get ahead of the story and, in essence, allow Khadr to get his money before the Spears in the United States and Lane Moore, who was also injured in the attack, could prevent the money from being sent to the Spear family. So I think that might have something to do with it, why it was hastened along so quickly, because it wasn't supposed to come out at that time. It was broken by the Globe and Mail. And I think also if the Conservatives try and make this a 2019 election issue, I think they're going to have people in the NDP, the Liberals, and the media jumping on them for this as some form of Islamic racist kind of campaign platform. When, I mean, it's quite clear here that the vast majority of the public, at least right now, agrees with the general sentiment that the money should not have been paid.
Mm-hmm. And the fact that the Conservatives will try, they might try and make this an election issue, as you said, but they'll probably get lambasted in the media over it. But the fact remains that even a majority of Liberal Party supporters don't even agree with this decision. So, I mean, it's something really that the media hasn't really been talking about. They've been trying to say that it's about 50-50. You know, when you look at the public opinion and opinion articles and editorials, they usually go back and forth. They say some say that it's okay, some don't. But really, 71% is a significant amount.
And that's well without the margin of error in a poll like this. So
yeah, exactly.
We know it's definitely a strong majority in this case. So
indeed.
It's going to be very interesting to see where this goes and how many weeks it keeps up for. We're already here at 2 weeks at the right side, so 2.5 weeks in public and in the mainstream media. So we'll have to see how long it's kept up for. But All right. So while this is going on, in our firing line segment, we are also taking a look at the most recent NDP leadership debate. And yes, contrary to what you might hear in the media, there is another leadership race going on with the federal NDP. We don't hear about it all that much, but there is action happening on that front. So a few tidbits from the most recent debate as covered by The Rebel. So while the summer continues, we know this leadership race is happening. There's debates, and there's 4 people campaigning in the race who have effectively said that they want to do away with capitalism if they win the NDP leadership race and manage to form government in 2019. Jagmeet Singh believes that Canada is a genocidal country filled with, quote, systemic inequality and systemic racism. So obviously that would be a key point of his platform in 2019 to get rid of that. But, we take it one step further. In French, the candidates were asked what area of the economy the government should run that they currently do not. Nikki Ashton said that she believes that the government should be running a bank, and that bank could be administered by the post office. She also wants the government to take over the green energy sector and have the government supply medication to the pharmacists. So government control of the green energy sector and the pharmaceutical industry in Canada. The NDP leadership race contestants were also asked about the Regina Manifesto, which was adopted by the CCF in 1933, which was the precursor to the modern NDP, and which piece of that vision should be brought into Canada with the modern NDP should they form government. The CCF, of course, was the predecessor to the NDP, and the document states that no CCF government will rest content until it has eradicated capitalism and put into operation the full program of socialized planning which will lead to the establishment in Canada of the cooperative commonwealth. Put simply, this means that the current crop of NDP candidates feel that capitalism in Canada should be reined back or severely limited. Mr. Singh in the most recent debate, has also advocated for income redistribution. He states that people have wealth and they need to transfer that wealth to those living in poverty now. He also feels that wealth transfers are completely different from social programs and should have a major role in Canada. Furthermore, none of the candidates say that they will work with the Liberal government in a minority government scenario in order to keep the Conservatives from taking power. So all 4 of these platform points are significant changes to the way that Canada would currently work. And I'd like everyone to think back to when Justin Trudeau was running for Liberal leadership when they were the third party in the House of Commons. The Liberal leadership race received much more attention than the current NDP leadership race is currently receiving. And the media is once again doing a disservice to Canadians by not informing them of who is running for leader of our current third party in Canada. The Liberals made the jump from third party to governing party in the last election, and the Alberta NDP moved from third party to governing party in the Alberta 2015 election. So we know that nothing in Canada is impossible when it comes to elections, and ultimately elections have consequences, and in order to make informed decisions, the population, you guys listening to the right side, need to know what is going on with this NDP leadership race, and the media is not providing that information that people need to make the right decisions. So it's quite clear that the media has really dropped the ball on this NDP leadership race.
Yeah, I think if you asked common people, they could probably tell you that the Conservative leadership race was going on, because you could see it every single week. They were talking about different candidates. But the NDP leadership race has not gained that much attention whatsoever, and the fact that a lot of the people, they believe that capitalism is something that should be done away with, and it seems like the NDP is moving further to the left than even what they were before, and that's something that's going to be kind of interesting to see what happens in the election, because if the NDP want to regain a lot of the seats that they lost in the 2015 election, one would think they would be looking to try and attract, disenchanted liberal voters from the center, but moving further to the left, I would think that would take away from a lot of that.
It seems as though we're not really hearing that much in the media about this, and the race ends sometime between the middle of September and the 1st of October, depending on how their votes go. So we will definitely keep an eye on this going forward, because I think that's something we need to do for the good of everyone who listens to us and is going to be voting in the next election here in Canada.
Yeah, and it's interesting to note that Peter Julian, who was in the race, actually just withdrew his candidacy just last week, and we're going to be having the next leadership debate in Victoria, which of course is my hometown, on August the 2nd. So we're probably going to hear more about it in August, and of course the deadline to become an NDP member and be eligible to vote is August 17th. So it's going to be continuing on throughout the summer, and we will see if the media picks up on more of this stuff, because this is something that I think the Canadians deserve to know more about.
It's ground shaking, the stuff that's being talked about in this debate. And I mean, everyone, like you said, in the Conservative debate, if anyone mentioned abortion or any contentious social issues, the media were on it for a good couple days. So definitely some bias there in the media.
And I think that even if you look at past NDP leaders, I really don't think Jack Layton or Tom Mulcair would bring the party that far to left as to be doing away with capitalism. So this is a really big issue that deserves to be talked about.
Huge shift for the party.
Yeah.
All right. So what do you got for word of the week?
So our word of the week this week is reconciliation. So it's defined as the restoration of friendly relations, as in his reconciliation with your uncle, or the colonel was seeking a reconciliation with his wife. It could also be defined as the action of making one view or belief compatible with another, as in he aims to bring about a reconciliation between art and technology. So I think one of the reasons why we picked this word this week is because of the ongoing efforts of probably the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and what they are doing, but also in the sense of our BC story, where a lot of reconciliation was happening between the RCMP and the First Nations, and how they were able to work together to fight off the fires that are happening in BC. But there was another story that came out this week of some Liberal MPs that were urging Trudeau to appoint the First Nations Governor General in the name of reconciliation.
And of course, we know that Trudeau chose the Canadian astronaut Julie Payette to be the next Governor General of Canada, which of course was in line with his other campaign promises of equality between men and women and focus on the innovation in science and math fields in Canada.
Yeah, exactly. And it's something that Trudeau had said that he was going to do in bringing more diversity to it. But I think that having a Governor General is something that you want to do based on merit, considering that when you look at the past BC election and what the Lieutenant Governors had been going through, and how basically, I think one of my political science teachers called the Governor General basically the constitutional spare tire. You really want to have it. Usually you don't need it that often, but when you do need it, you really do need it. And it's something it's very important in our Canadian democracy to have reconciliation between the First Nations and the government in order to have a good working relationship. But I think it's when you're talking about something as important as the Governor General, it needs to be an appointment based on merit.
Most definitely. And, back in the first Harper minority government, that is actually the reason that he chose David Johnston for his Governor General and extended his term, which was a little bit odd to see happen. But he wanted David Johnston in there so that there would be a sound voice on the Constitution should the need arise in a minority government scenario.
Yeah, it's interesting to note that the BC Lieutenant Governor Judith Guichon, when she was going through the problems with the BC hung Parliament of this last election, she actually consulted with David Johnston on his constitutional expertise on how to resolve the issue, and so this is something that whoever it is that gets appointed needs to really know what they're talking about, because it's such an important issue in our democracy.
Indeed it is, and I'm sure, though, that, with the appropriate resources, the new Governor General will be just fine and come up to speed very quickly on the constitutional matters should they arise in the minority government scenario in 2019. But I believe that's it for this week on The Right Side, unless there's anything else we need to mention.
I think that's all we have this week. So, of course, if you want to find us, you can find us at rightsidenews.ca. We've got full show notes there as well as all the episodes. If you want to find us through iTunes, just go to rightsidenews.ca/iTunes. And if you want to find us on social media, you can find us at Twitter and Facebook at RightSideCA.
Thank you for sharing your time with us, and we'll see you next week for another episode.
We will see you next week, and we'll bring you more of the right side of the news.